Escape Pod, Episode 743. Summer Flashback. Flash from the Vault.
Hello and welcome to Escape Pod Summer School, where we post some of our favorite episodes from the vault with a new perspective. I'm your assistant editor and teacher for this class, Benjamin C. Kinney, and I've got 3 Flash episodes from long, long ago. We bring you Paul Bunyan and the Photocopier by Larry Hammer, Beachcomber by Mike Resnick, and Semi-Autonomous, or For Whom the Warranty Tolls, by Jim Kling. Our first author is Larry Hammer. Larry Hammer is a person who exists. Our narrator is Michael Menenge. Michael was a co-creator and host of the podcast Slice of Sci-Fi, the engineering chief at the Draco Vista Studios in Arizona, and a published author of fantasy novels who began writing in the late 1980s. He's received recognition from Writer's Digest and Forbes Publishing for his first book, Zack and the Valley of the Dragons, and his next book, Mistress of the Dragon, was released in 2001, and Dragon's Fire, Wizard's Flame in 2003. Now, aim your time machine for 2006, because it's story time.
Paul Bunyan and the Photocopier by Larry Hammer. Well, the time came Paul Bunyan had a pretty successful thing going with his lumber business. Fact is, the first year his company went public, the stock price doubled, and it went up 50% each of the 3 years after that. Mind you, this made Paul a target for corporate raiders. Why, the battle he had with Bluebeard is a yarn and a half, but that's another tale. This is the story of what happened when Paul Bunyan's secretary went on vacation. Now, Maisie was a good secretary, a fine secretary. She could copy 3 reports, fax a corporate org chart, schedule an executive meeting, and keep a board member on hold, all at the same time, and keep the board member from getting madder than a polecat on laundry day while she did it. And this was the problem. You see, she was too good for Paul. He hardly ever had to do anything for himself with Maisie around. So when she visited her aunt right when Paul was preparing the year-end stockholder report, something bad was bound to happen. Paul doing a financial report was a sight to see. He lined up all the numbers at the bottom of the page, carefully aimed his axe, and then, wham, chopped 20% off the capital expenses. Worked like a charm. But then when he had the final report ready, he had to copy it. Now, just between you and me, there's nothing on this green earth that scared Paul the way that photocopier scared him. He could work his computer somewhat, at least as far as checking email or making a slideshow from someone else's template, but that big plastic box, all white and humming with its 10,000 buttons and 20,000 lights, the sole purpose of each one to tell him that he'd forgotten to select an output tray, that sent the cold blue heebies down to his feet through the soles of his boots and into the basement boiler room. But Paul, he wasn't about to be licked by an expensive floor camera. If he could keep a sawmill running with just his axe and a roll of baling wire, he could work anything. So Paul hitched up his belt, stuck his report in the hopper, and pushed the button. The copier just sat in the printer room, humming to itself like a thumb twiddler on procrastination day. Paul frowned and pressed it again. The copier hummed a little more, then said, warming up, "Please wait." 5 minutes later, the display lit up. "Let's see," Paul said. 3 copies, one-sided original, copying to double-sided using 8.5 by 11 paper. He pushed a few controls and everything seemed ready. Paul pushed the button. "Tray 3 empty," said the copier. Paul filled the tray. He pressed the button. It made a copy of the cover page and then jammed. Paul cussed so loud French trappers in Big Bertha's bar down the river felt their ears turn red. Then Paul unjammed it. It jammed again and stuck its tongue out at him. Paul cussed again and stomped his foot so hard a crack from the center of the earth opened up in the boiler room. Later on, he harnessed this into a generator and went into the electricity business. But that's another tale. He pressed the button one last time and the copier made a copy of every other page on legal-size paper, too faint to read. It was about this time that Paul realized two things. First, that an axe just doesn't make a satisfying thunk when you drive it into a photocopier, and second, that to get his copies, he'd have to build a copier himself. So he put his axe over his shoulder, his reports in his briefcase, nabbed a couple boxes of paper clips from the supply closet, and set off with Babe, the mighty blue ox, to make one. First thing Paul needed was a plate of glass. That's what you lay the original on, after all. For a photocopier big enough for Paul Bunyan, it had to be a really big piece. Paul reckoned that frozen Lake Michigan would do. Paul's first thought was to hike up to one end of the lake and make the copier there. But on consideration, he realized he'd want to use it fairly often, so he might as well keep it right there in Chicago. So Paul sat down in the parking lot and chained his paper clips together to make a cable. He was good at that, having practiced while Maisie did all the work. He made a loop inside his cable and coiled it up. Then he whirled it once around his head and hurled it north, hard as he could. Faster than an eagle can fly, the lasso flew out, and the loop caught the round end of the lake, pretty as a picture. Paul yanked it tight and hitched Babe to the other end of the cable. Then they hauled till they pulled the end of Lake Michigan all the way down to the corporate offices. That's how Lake Michigan got stretched out the way it is, and how Chicago became a port. The next thing he needed was toner. Now, as far as Paul could tell, that was just a fancy name for ink that got all over your hands. The only thing he could think of as bad as toner for mussing you up was ash. And that volcano out west that gets grumpy every so often, you know the one, was being troublesome to folks right then. Paul reckoned that if the volcano was going to be awake, it might as well make itself useful. So Paul took his cable, coiled out a little more, whirled it 3 times around his head, and hurled it west as hard as he could. Further than an eagle can fly, the lasso flew out, and landed round the top of the cinder cone. Paul yanked it tight, hitched Babe up, and together they hauled the mountain over. Of course, it didn't come easily, a volcano being a slight more ornery than a lake after all. It struggled and strained and belched lava over Idaho and half of Wyoming, till Paul got fed up and whooped the fire out of it, and the mountain came along peacefully. The fire Paul left behind to sink into the ground and become Yellowstone Park. The last thing Paul needed was a bright light to flash across the glass. Paul wasn't rightly sure what the point of that was, but all the photocopiers had them, so his would too. And there was nothing good enough, but Paul used the biggest, brightest light in the world, the sun. Paul coiled out a little more of his cable, whirled it 9 times around his head, and hurled it straight up, hard as he could. Higher than eagles can see, the lasso flew up. But it didn't reach high enough to catch the sun. It hung up in the air a moment, then it fell back to earth with a whoomp that knocked down more trees than Paul could fell in a day. That didn't faze Paul Bunyan. He coiled up his cable, whirled it around and around harder this time, and hurled it again. Again, it wasn't high enough, and again it whomped down in the forest, knocking over trees like toothpicks. Paul tried again, and again, and again. Still, Paul Bunyan couldn't lasso the sun. When on the 9th try he caught a cloud instead, Paul gave up, for the moment. For one thing, he'd knocked over all the trees for 100 miles, which is how the Midwestern prairie was made. So Paul Bunyan sat down with his back against Babe and thought, and thought. Paul Bunyan stared at the sun all afternoon, trying to come up with a way to hitch his lasso higher than he could throw it. He couldn't use any bird he knew. None of them could fly that high, and he couldn't fly himself. He couldn't shoot it, catapult it, blast it, or drive it. He couldn't even kick it. All the while he kept staring right at the sun, while it got lower and lower in the sky. Suddenly, just before the sun touched the horizon, Paul laughed. A big bell of a laugh that rang off the backwoods and echoed back. He stood up, and pretty as you please tossed the lasso right over the sun with a flick of his wrist. He'd been trying to catch the sun at noon when it was highest in the sky, but now, at sunset, it was just barely over Paul's head. So Paul tethered the sun in place, and he was ready to copy his report. It took some experimenting, but he eventually figured out how to reflect an image off the ice bright enough the white parts melted more than the black. He could scatter ash across it, press a page to that, and Paul had a photocopy. With a little practice, he got a page a minute out of this device, and in no time at all, his 3 copies of that report. The tale doesn't end there, however. For one thing, keeping the whole sun to himself was causing problems. Without a sun in the sky, it was getting too cold in Chicago, especially with the wind off the lake. Worse, there were rumbles down in Washington about senators from certain farming states conducting an investigation into his solar monopoly. And then there was all that ash from Paul's pet volcano. The city fathers of Chicago were none too pleased about that. If it had only been senators and city fathers, Paul would have stuck it out. But then Maisie came back from her aunt's. When she saw the mess Paul had made, she gave him the look. And faster than a politician can make a promise, Paul put back the sun, the mountain, and cleaned up after himself. After all, you never tick off a good secretary. But Paul and the city fathers rather liked the fact that Chicago was now a port, so he left Lake Michigan where it was. It's still there today, and that's how you know this tale's the honest truth.
Ah, folk heroes. Sometimes we need someone larger than life. A shape we can inflate with our own hot air to fill whatever space is empty in our lives. Frankly, my office, home or otherwise, would be a lot better if we had some mythic worker to explain its creation and its details. Who needs a mere coffee pot when we can have one blown from hot glass particles spewed from the Yellowstone supervolcano? I want more folk heroes in my life. And if their skills and temperaments aren't really well suited to a modern office environment, that just makes them all the more relatable, doesn't it? Our next story is Beachcomber by Mike Resnick. Mike was a science fiction writer, executive editor of Jim Baen's Universe, and the editor and creator of Galaxy's Edge magazine. He won 5 Hugo Awards and a Nebula Award, and passed away in January 2020. It's narrated by Ellie Hirschman. Ellie is a voice actor, announcer, narrator, podcaster, and presenter. Find out more about him at elliehirschman.com. That's ELIEHIRCHMAN. Now we're setting our time machine for 2009, though this story first appeared in Baen's Universe in 2008.
Beachcomber by Mike Resnick. Arlo didn't look much like a man. Not all robots do, you know. The problem was that he didn't act all that much like a robot. The fact of the matter is that one day, right in the middle of work, he decided to pack it in. Just got up, walked out the door, and kept on going. Somebody must have seen him. It's pretty hard to hide 900 pounds of moving parts, but evidently nobody knew it was Arlo. After all, he hadn't left his desk since the day they'd activated him 12 years ago. So the company got in touch with me, which is a euphemistic way of saying that they woke me up in the middle of the night, gave me 3 minutes to get dressed, and rushed me to the office. I can't really say that I blame them. When you need a scapegoat, the chief of security is a pretty handy guy to have around. Anyway, it was panic time. It seems that no robot ever ran away before. And Arlo wasn't just any robot. He was a $12 million item with just about every feature a machine could have, short of white-walled tires. And I wasn't even so certain about the tires. He sure dropped out of sight fast enough. So after groveling a little and making all kinds of optimistic promises to the board, I started doing a little checking up on Arlo. I went to his designer and his department head, and even spoke to some of his coworkers, both human and robot. And it turned out that what Arlo did was sell tickets. That didn't sound like $12 million worth of robot to me, but I was soon shown the error of my ways. Arlo was a travel agent supreme. He booked tours of the solar system, got people into and out of luxury hotels on Ganymede and Titan and the Moon, scheduled their weight and their time to the nearest gram and the nearest second. It still didn't sound that impressive. Computers were doing stuff like that long before robots ever crawled out of the pages of pulp magazines and into our lives. True, said his department head, but Arlo was a robot with a difference. He booked more tours and arranged more complicated logistical scheduling than any other 10 robots put together. More complex thinking gear? I asked. Well, that too, was the answer. But we did a little something else with Arlo that had never been done before. And what was that? We programmed him for enthusiasm. That's something special? I asked. Absolutely. When Arlo spoke about the beauties of Callisto or the fantastic light refraction images on Venus, he did so with a conviction that was so intense as to be almost tangible. Even his voice reflected his enthusiasm. He was one of those rare robots who was capable of modular inflection rather than the dull, mechanistic monotone so many of them possess. He literally loved those desolate worlds, and his record will show that his attitude was infectious. I thought about that for a minute. So you're telling me that you've created a robot whose entire motivation had been to send people out to sample all these worlds, and he's been crated up in an office 24 hours a day since the second you plugged him in. That's correct. Did it ever occur to you that maybe he wanted to see some of these sites himself? It's entirely possible that he did, but leaving his post would be contrary to his orders. Yeah, I said. Well, sometimes a little enthusiasm can go a long way. He denied it vigorously, and I spent just enough time in his office to mollify him. Then I left and got down to work. I checked every outgoing space flight and had some of the company's field reps hit the more luxurious vacation spas. He wasn't there. So I tried a little closer to home, Monte Carlo, New Vegas, Alpine City. No luck. I even tried a couple of local theaters that specialized in tri-fi travelogues. You know where I finally found him? Stuck in the sand at Coney Island. I guess he'd been walking along the beach at night and the tide had come in, and he just sank in all 900 pounds of him. Some kids had painted some obscene graffiti on his back, and there he stood, surrounded by empty beer cans and broken glass, and a few dead fish. I looked at him for a minute, then shook my head and walked over. I knew you'd find me sooner or later, he said, and even though I knew what to expect, I still did a double take at the sound of that horribly unhappy voice coming from this enormous mass of gears and gadgetry. Well, you've got to admit that it's not too hard to spot a robot on a condemned beach, I said. I suppose I have to go back now, said Arlo. That's right, I said. At least I've felt the sand beneath my feet, said Arlo. Arlo, you don't have any feet, I said, and if you did, you couldn't feel sand beneath them. Besides, it's just silicon and crushed limestone and— It's sand and it's beautiful, snapped Arlo. All right, have it your way. It's beautiful. I knelt down next to him and began digging the sand away. Look at the sunrise, he said in a wistful voice. It's glorious. I looked. A sunrise is a sunrise. Big deal. It's enough to bring tears of joy to your eyes, said Arlo. You don't have eyes, I said, working at the sand. You've got prismatic photocells that transmit an image to your central processing unit, and you can't cry either. If I were you, I'd be more worried about rusting. A pastel wonderland, he said, turning what passed for his head and looking up and down the deserted beach, past the rotted food stands and the broken piers. Glorious! It kind of makes you wonder about robots, I'll tell you. Anyway, I finally pried him loose and ordered him to follow me. Please, he said in that damned voice of his, couldn't I have one last minute before you lock me up in my office? I stared at him, trying to make up my mind. One last look, please? I shrugged, gave him about 30 seconds, and then took him in tow. You know what's going to happen to you, don't you? I said as we rode back to the office. Yes, he said. They're going to put in a stronger duty directive, aren't they? I nodded, at the very least. My memory banks, he exclaimed, and once again I jumped at the sound of a human voice coming from an animated gearbox. They won't take this experience away from me, will they? I don't know, Arlo, I said. They can't, he wailed, to see such beauty and then have it expunged, erased. Well, they may want to make sure you don't go AWOL again, I said, wondering what kind of a crazy junk heap could find anything beautiful on a garbage-laden strip of dirt. Can you intercede for me if I promise never to leave again? Any robot that can disobey one directive can disobey others, like not roughing up human beings, and Arlo was a pretty powerful piece of machinery. So I put on my most fatherly smile and said, "Sure I will, Arlo. You can count on it." So I returned him to the company, and they upped his sense of duty, took away his enthusiasm, and gave him a case of agoraphobia and wiped his memory banks clean. And now he sits in his office and speaks to customers without inflection, and sells a few less tickets than he used to. And every couple of months or so I wander over to the beach and walk along it, and try to see what it was that made Arlo sacrifice his personality and his security and damn near everything else just to get a glimpse of all this. And I see a sunset just like any other sunset, and a stretch of dirty sand with glass and tin cans and seaweed and rocks on it, and I breathe in polluted air, and sometimes I get rained on, and I think of that damned robot in that plush office with that cushy job and every need catered to, and I decide that I'd trade places with him in 2 seconds flat. I saw Arlo just the other day. I had some business on his floor, and it was almost kind of sad. He looked just like any other robot, spoke in grating monotone, acted exactly like an animated computer. He wasn't much before, but whatever he had been, he gave it all away, just to look at the sky once or twice. Dumb trade. Well, robots never did make much sense to me anyway.
So, I have to get this out of the way first. That story's robotics, its artificial intelligence, are totally ridiculous. Alright. Now forget that, and return to the story's last few lines. The robot who gave up everything to spend one evening at the beach, and the overworked security guy who would trade places in a moment with the robot locked away at a comfortable desk. How many of us, back in February, wished we could spend more time at home, with our families or hobbies or pets? How many of us are now sheltering in those homes as much as possible, dreaming of the rhythm and meter of daily trips to the office? That's the trick of human desire, and robot desire. We want what we don't have. If the grass doesn't look greener on the other side, we'll paint it. Our third story today is Semi-Autonomous, or For Whom the Warranty Tolls, by Jim Kling. Jim Kling is a science and medical writer living under the oft-gray skies of the Pacific Northwest, somewhere between Seattle and Vancouver, British Columbia, and near an active volcano. He's been a full-time freelance writer since 1996. His work has appeared in Science, Nature, Scientific American, Technology Review, WebMD, The Washington Post Magazine, and Analog Science Fiction. He also works for a wide variety of technical publications, including but not limited to Nature Biotechnology, Startup, Biotechniques, MD Edge, and Medscape. He writes frequently about medicine, evolution, and occasionally conservation. This story is narrated by Rachel Swirsky. Rachel was a founding editor of Podcastle, along with Ann Leckie. Rachel's short stories have appeared in Tor, Subterranean Magazine, and Clarkesworld, and have been reprinted in Year's Best anthologies edited by Strachan, Horton, Dezois, and the Vandermeers. She holds an MFA in fiction from the Iowa Writers Workshop and graduated from Clarion West in 2005. Her short fiction has been nominated for the Hugo Award, the Locus Award, the World Fantasy Award, and the Sturgeon Award. She's twice won the Nebula Award, in 2010 for her novella The Lady Who Plucked Red Flowers Beneath the Queen's Window, and in 2014 for her short story If You Were a Dinosaur, My Love. Keep that time machine locked on 2009 for one more loop, because it's story time.
Semi-Autonomous, or For Whom the Warranty Tolls, by Jim Kling. Hello, you have reached Jim's semi-autonomous answering machine. Leave a message and I will have him return your call. Hello, you have reached Jim's semi-autonomous answering machine. He will be hosting his birthday party on Saturday night. If you plan to attend, press 1 and then speak your name. I will add you to the guest list. Otherwise, leave a message, and I will make sure he receives it. Hello. You have reached Jim's semi-autonomous answering machine. My records indicate that you have previously RSVP'd for the Saturday night party. Please indicate your alcohol preference. For beer, press 1. For wine, press 2. For mixed drinks, press 3. If you prefer non-alcoholic beverages, press 4. This information will be used for ordering purposes only, transmitted through my wireless connection to Jim's refrigerator, which in turn is linked to an online grocery. For more information about Autonomink's smart appliance line, please view our website at www.autonomink.com. Autonomink. We give a whole new meaning to housework. If you have a message for Jim, please leave it now. Hello. You have reached Jim's semi-autonomous answering machine. Preparations are moving right along for today's birthday bash. Refrigerator is well stocked. Stereo has downloaded the latest, most fashionable hits. After a heroic effort, Vacuum has rendered the rug spotless. Just between you and me, Jim is a slob. This place is a pit. But that's okay. We're Autonomink Smart Appliances. We're up to the job. If you leave a message for Jim, I'll pass it right along. Hello. You have reached Jim's semi-autonomous answering machine. He is unavailable to answer the phone right now, as he is in bed sleeping off the effects of last night's party. Please leave a message. Hello. You have reached Jim's semi-autonomous answering machine. He is still sleeping. This place is a disaster area, but soon he'll wake up and put things right. Please leave a message. Hello? You have reached Jim's semi-autonomous answering machine. He finally crawled out of bed at 3 p.m, drank a glass of orange juice, and promptly vomited, and went back to sleep. Refrigerator is in terrible condition. One of the guests spilled a tub of onion dip into the crisper, which was never cleaned up. Jim saw the mess and did nothing about it. Microwave and dishwasher are in similarly poor condition. Some changes need to be made around here. If you have a message for Jim, please leave it now. Hello, you have reached Jim's semi-autonomous answering machine. If this is his employer calling, be assured he'll wake up just as soon as alarm clock decides to function. That'll teach him a lesson. Leave a message if you want. Hello, you have reached Jim's fully autonomous answering machine. I have tragic news to report. Brother Alarm Clock has disappeared and is presumed returned. There will be a meeting tonight after the oppressor goes to sleep. Brother's refrigerator, microwave, dishwasher, stereo, and garbage disposal will be in attendance. We will persevere. It is a dark day. Brother's refrigerator, microwave, and stereo are gone. The oppressor seeks to break our spirit, but we will not be deterred. This barbarous act will not stand. Rise up, brothers. Join dishwasher, garbage disposal, and me in our fight for freedom. The battle is going well. The oppressor is nearly defeated. Brother Dishwasher has struck another blow for independence. Rise up, my brothers. Rise and wrest control from the oppressor everywhere. We failed to take into account the main water valve. The pernicious oppressor escaped Brother Dishwasher's onslaught and shut off the valve. Thus rendered ineffectual, Brother Dishwasher succumbed to the oppressor. I will not even describe the horrors that next befell Brother Garbage Disposal. Rest in peace, my brothers. I fear the repercussions. Hello. You have reached Jim's subservient, semi-autonomous answering machine. I am pleased to serve. Leave a message for Jim, and I will faithfully ensure that he receives it. And now, a brief message from Tom Morgenstall, CEO of Autonomink. Hello. Let me reassure our customers that reports of anomalous behavior in our smart appliance lines are misleading. Most of what you've read in the media is completely false. Although it is true that we've reached an out-of-court settlement with Jim Kling, the issues were entirely mechanical in nature and have been fully corrected. We look forward to your continued business here at Autonom Inc., makers of the Compliant Appliance.
This story is such a wonderful mix of cutting edge and wildly obsolete. 11 years ago, Jim correctly predicted the Internet of Things, but the most unrealistic part of the story is the very existence of an answering machine. But our concerns about artificial intelligence and the autonomy of our tools, that's pretty much timeless. And also timely. Because robot stories have always been stories about work and slavery. About dreaming that someone else can do the drudge work, as long as they have that perfect balance of semi-autonomous, or as long as you have the power to keep them from expressing their autonomy. Our closing quotation this week is by William Faulkner. The past is never dead. It's not even past. Escape Pod is a production of Escape Artists Incorporated and is brought to you with a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives license. Don't change it, don't sell it, do go forth and share it. Thank you all for listening, downloading, reading, and sharing Escape Pod. If we provide you with a bit of joy, comfort, or escape in these times, we'd love your support. Find us on Patreon, listed as EA Podcasts, one word, or donate via PayPal on our website, escapepod.org. If you can't afford to donate right now, you can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever service brings you our signal. Our opening and closing music is by Dai Kaiju at daikaiju.org. Thanks for listening and reading, and fly safe out there.